Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Cambridge Digital Bible Research. I'm Elizabeth. This video is our at a glance for Psalm 2. The purpose of this at a glance, or synthesis, is to capture the inner logic of the psalm. It's our starting place for understanding the psalm. We've titled Psalm 2, My King on Zion. This psalm is about earthly kings, the heavenly king, and most importantly, God's own king on Mount Zion, the place where heaven and earth meet. Each of these kings has a speech in Psalm 2, which helps structure the psalm as a whole. First, the earthly kings announce their rebellion. The heavenly king, God, responds. Then, God's anointed king announces God's decree. The final section, in which the rebels are given an ultimatum, is the only one with no embedded speech. In the opening scene, the rebellion, earthly kings gather together to overthrow the rule of the Lord and his chosen king. How does one king rebel against another? In the ancient world, there were often kings of different ranks, with one king ruling over one or more other kings. This relationship was formalized in a treaty. Lesser kings were often not content with their position. When they thought themselves strong enough, they would try to rebel to gain independence. They chose times when the greater kingdom was vulnerable, such as a change in ruler. This explains the connection between the rebellion and the anointing. The Lord has anointed his chosen king on Zion, but the earthly kings are hoping this is their chance to rebel. The imagery the rebels use is that of restraints and chains. They compare the boundaries and constraints set by the great king, God, to restraints and chains keeping them in servitude. They no longer want to accept this servitude, so want to rip off the restraints and throw away the chains. The heavenly king, God, is not impressed with the intended rebellion. He laughs, in fact. He derides them and responds with his own speech. I have forged my king as my image on Zion, my sacred mountain. This kind of laughter is not of amusement and joy, but of derision and scorn, mixed with anger. God's laughter expresses the futility of the wicked's plans. He can already see that their plans will fail. No matter how hard the earthly kings try to resist his authority, there is no way they will ever succeed. God laughs at their efforts and responds with anger. The speech, I have forged my king, is unusual language. The literal Hebrew is, I have poured out my king. The imagery is that of casting metal, as in pouring out a molten image. In the ancient world, when a king was physically absent, a cast image could represent his presence and authority. This was the logic behind idols. The images of deities represented their presence and authority on earth. Here in Psalm 2, God uses the same logic to speak of setting up his king to rule on Zion as his own image, to represent his own presence and authority. A living image, cast not of metal, but of flesh. This image is placed on Zion, God's holy mountain. This was the meeting place between heaven and earth. So the image on Zion represented God's direct interaction with earth. His image is placed on Zion as the presence and authority of the heavenly king within the realm of earth. In the third section of the psalm, the speaker is now identified as this king whom the Lord has poured out. The anointed king declares the Lord's decree. The core content is this statement in bold. You are my son. Today I've become your father. From the molten image, we know the king was to represent God's authority. Here, in verses 7 to 9, the picture is of the king as a son in addition to an image. This language of creating family relationships is language used for establishing covenants. Throughout the Old Testament, God would often say of Israel, I will be their God, and they will be my people. This language creates a legally binding relationship. When this king is called God's son, it means two things. First is the official relationship, referring to the covenant God made with David in 2 Samuel 7. There, he promised to establish David's dynasty forever, with the king's job being to represent the Heavenly Father on earth. This is more than just a political alliance, however. In addition, this son resembles his father and actively seeks to be like him. He repeats his father's words, interests, and as we'll see, even gets angry at the same things his father gets angry at. The father, in turn, says he will give this son an inheritance. In the ancient world, firstborn sons inherited their father's property. The Son of God here has only to ask, and he will inherit the whole earth. What he will do with that inheritance, however, is not pleasant. The decree continues. You will crush them with an iron scepter and shatter them like pottery. This is strong language. A scepter is a rod or staff held by a king as a symbol of his royal sovereignty. Iron was a symbol of strength, and clay pots were a symbol of fragility. When iron comes into contact with clay, the outcome is predictable. And when clay pots are shattered, there is no putting them back together. The implication for the nations is plain. If they continue in rebellion, they will be crushed, shattered like bits of pottery, with no hope of recovery. That decree, citing God directly, now comes in a different form in the words of the anointed king. He issues his own ultimatum to the kings of the earth, urging them to recognize the futility of their rebellion and choose to serve him rather than to perish. Although God mocks the attempt to rebel and is determined to crush any rebellion, neither he nor his king delights in the destruction of the nations. This ultimatum captures both sides of this reality, warning the nations of their danger and pleading with them to wise up and receive the rebuke that they might not be crushed, that they might not perish. The only way out is to submit to the Lord and his anointed king, to turn their angry words of rebellion into shaking yet joyful words of submission. Part of this plea to the kings of the earth is to kiss the Son. Kissing was a gesture of submission. It was a way for lower kings to show honor to the higher king. Kissing the Son would be how the earthly kings would demonstrate their submission to the Lord and his Son, this king he has poured out. The phrase, kiss the Son, includes an Aramaic word, which makes it stand out in the psalm. Aramaic was an international language spoken in the broader region at the time. Go to our website for more detail. The king is not only God's son for the Hebrew-speaking world, but he is also God's son for the international world. And they can prove their submission to his authority, once more, by kissing him. The son's anger flares up quickly. Here, we see the king's personality emerge, beyond mostly quoting others' words. His action, becoming angry, mirrors God's own anger in verse 5. The son is showing his resemblance to the father, demonstrating both his legitimacy as king, as well as the severity of the ultimatum. All of God's authority is given to the king, and if rebellion angers him, he'll be quick to bring destruction. This quickness to anger may seem incompatible with the pleading to the nations to serve. Both God and his king are angered by the rebellion. Yet the anger does not prevent them from urging the kings to think again and change their allegiance. This is not an uncontrolled anger, but a very targeted anger. The end of Psalm 2 is very similar to the beginning of Psalm 1, the very beginning of the Psalter. Happy the one, or here's two. In Psalm 1, the celebrated one was one who rejected the path of wickedness and delighted in the instruction of the Lord. In Psalm 2, those who follow the path of wickedness are addressed. The celebrated ones here include those who do wise up, receive the rebuke, and choose to shelter in the anointed king of the Lord. The options are either being the target of anger by the king or sheltering in this king. The image of sheltering refers to the protection that a high king would offer to lesser kings. A lesser king would not need to fear invasion, even from very great kings, if he had the protection of his own great king. This is an invitation to return to the treaty at the beginning, in which the lesser king submits and the great king protects. This is the great king's desire, first to crush rebellion, but ultimately to protect those who serve him. We now see the full picture. There is rebellion on earth, but the heavenly king responds by laughing at its futility. His decree is that his king on Zion will crush any rebellion. The nations are thus given the ultimatum: either serve the Lord once more or perish. There is no alternative. These sections are tied to different locations. Both the rebellion and the ultimatum are addressed to earthly kings, which is why they share the same color, gray. The heavenly king, far above the earth, is represented with yellow. But the king on Zion has elements of both heaven and earth, because God himself, the heavenly king, has established him, and because he is established on earth. He is where heaven and earth meet on Mount Zion. We noted that each of the first three sections ends with an embedded speech. The first section ends with the rebel's speech. The second ends with God's speech to the rebels. And the third section ends with God's speech to his anointed. We might expect the fourth section to also end with an embedded speech, the rebel's reply. But it doesn't. The poetic effect is to leave the hearer in suspense, wondering what their reply will be. As a psalm within Israelite worship, the effect would be that the ultimatum still stands, and they would have confidence that all nations would one day serve their God or perish. With these components in mind, we'll now read the psalm in its entirety. Why are all these nations gathered together? Why do they waste their time plotting? Why would kings of earth band together in rebellion against the Lord and his anointed king? Let's rip off their restraints. Let's throw away their chains. The God who reigns in heaven laughs. The Lord of all derides them. Now he speaks to them in wrath. He terrifies them with anger. I have forged my king as my image on Zion, my sacred mountain. I will declare the decree. The Lord said to me, "You are my son. Today I've become your father. Just ask, and I will give you nations for your inheritance and make the whole world your property. You will crush them with an iron scepter and shatter them like pottery." Now then, you kings, wise up. Receive this rebuke, you earthly rulers. Serve the Lord with reverence. Shout for joy and shake with fear. Kiss the Son, lest he become angry and you perish, for his anger flares up quickly. Here's to all who take shelter in him. This completes the Psalm at a glance for Psalm 2. All our videos are provided free thanks to donations. Visit www.cdbr.org to learn more. Thanks for watching.